When I was a little boy, I would often fall asleep, as everyone does. But I fall asleep in an unusual way. I fall asleep on the couch, I fall asleep in my bed without covers. And I'd be awakened by my mom or my dad as they entered my room, found me on the couch, covering me up. My mom and my dad, they cared not only that I slept, but that I slept well. They cared not only that I slept, but that I was warm while I slept. You've had my experience as a child. You've had my experience as a father or a mother, as a spouse. This love, this covering love, this love desires, that desires not only that we sleep, but we sleep well and that we are warm. That's the love of God that we see in our readings today. At the end of our first reading today, the Lord declares, I am compassionate. And we see that compassionate love in that love of covering others. That's the love that precedes the great commandment. We hear those two commandments in our gospel today, to love God and to love neighbor. Well, what comes before that is God's compassionate love of us. God is compassion, and that's what makes possible our love of Him. That's what makes possible our love of one another. So this morning, let's look at God's compassionate love for us and see how that makes possible our love for Him, our love for each other. What is God's love like? Well, we hear in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, for Christ, while we were still helpless, yet died at the appointed time for the ungodly. Indeed, only with difficulty does one die for a just person, though perhaps for a good person, one might even find courage to die. But God proves His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God loves us, not because we are particularly pleasant, not because we are particularly good, not because we are particularly attractive, not because we are particularly beneficial or useful to Him. As St. Paul says, we are helpless, we are ungodly, we are sinners. And that while we are those things, Christ dies for us. To use the language of our first reading, we are strangers, estranged from God. We are orphans, fatherless. We are widows, without a spouse. We are poor. And what does God do? He looks upon us and He becomes our home. He becomes our Father. He becomes our spouse. He becomes mercy for us. God loves us because He loves us. Not for any other reason than that. And that makes possible our response to Him. God's love is the beginning of our love for Him. As St. John says in his letter, we love because He first loved us. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that He has loved us. When we forget that, we cannot love Him. When we forget that we were strangers, orphans, widows, poor, we cannot respond to the love of God. This third, it also makes possible, God's love also makes possible our love of neighbor. And we hear that explicit connection in our first reading today. What does the Lord say in our first reading? But He says, look, you were once strangers, so treat strangers well. What does He tell us just after that? Look, the widows and the orphans, when you abuse them and they cry out to me, I will hear them. Explicitly echoing what He earlier told Moses in the book of Exodus. You're being abused by the Egyptians. I have heard your cry, and I will heal you. And you have cried out to me, and I have heard you. What the Lord is saying is, what I have done for you, you do for others. If we forget what the Lord has done for us, we cannot love others. If we forget what the Lord has done for us, we cannot do about this? God's love for us. God loves us because he loves us. He doesn't have any ulterior motives. He doesn't have anything to gain from it. To be God, that's what that means. What do we do? Where do we encounter God's love for us? We encounter God's love for us in his word. That's what the Bible is. The Bible is the great story of God's love for us. And so, if you want to love God, if you want to love your neighbor, my question is, where's your Bible? When's the last time that you opened it? If our Bible gets dusty, our love for God and neighbor are going to get dusty. If our Bible's in a drawer, our love for God and neighbor is going to be in a drawer. If our Bible's on a shelf, our love for God and neighbor is going to be on a shelf. But if our Bible is open, and if we encounter it, then our love for God and neighbor is alive. So, God's compassionate love for us, the love of my mom or my dad, we didn't really have anything to gain from covering me over. But they did it. They showed that love, which wasn't self-interested, but was selfless. And that's what the Lord reminds us. His selfless love